The ERMAC Centre is proud to present the SFU Canada Research Chairs Seminar Series. This bi-weekly series hosts 6 presentations per semester. For the fall 2009 semester, the presenters belong to the faculties of Applied Sciences, Arts and Social Sciences, Business Administration, and the Faculty of Education. Today's speaker is Dr. Kieran Egan, Canada Research Chair in Cognitive Development and the Curriculum, Faculty of Education.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm going to keep this short, that's why I wrote out my comments so I don't ramble. The purpose of the Canada Research Chairs program, as I think most of you know, is to provide Canadian universities with the opportunity to hire and to retain world-class researchers. Not only does the program provide a significant boost to Canada's research and development activity, but it also enhances the university's ability to educate graduate students who of course undertake research in conjunction with the Canada Research Chairs. We have about 40 of these research chairs assigned to us, and they span the full range of disciplines from the humanities to the sciences, applied sciences, social sciences, and so on. This is the second year that ERMAC has sponsored a series of lectures by our research chairs, and I'm very pleased with the range of topics that are being covered, and particularly the attempts on the part of the organizers to really cover the full spectrum of research that goes on at the university. Based on a number of different indicators, we know that Simon Fraser University has an enviable record of research productivity, and our Canada Research Chairs, I think, exemplify this in spades. I would like to express my thanks firstly to Peter Borwein, the co-director of ERMAC, and to Veselin Jungik for their work on developing this program. And I'm now going to turn the podium over to Colleen Toohey from the Faculty of Education to introduce today's speaker. Thanks.
Thank you. It's my very great pleasure to introduce to you my colleague Kieran Egan, Canada Research Chair in Cognitive Development and the Curriculum from the SFU Faculty of Education. Kieran holds many awards, one of which is the Grawemeyer Award in Education, which is something like the Nobel Prize in Education. He's a recipient of a Killam Research Fellowship. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a Foreign Associate member of the U.S. National Academy of Education. He's written many books and very many articles, and many of his books have been translated into other languages. He's had his research supported generously over the years by many agencies. The Imaginative Education Research Group that he founded and heads is globally active, and Kieran gives scholarly talks in many countries around the world, and he has also contributed to the professional development of teachers in Canada and abroad. In fact, a new imaginative education charter school started this September in Portland, Oregon. Kieran's educational ideas have been provocative, soundly argued, and have richly contributed to the education research community here and globally. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kieran Egan.
Thank you. Thank you, and welcome, and thank you for coming. What I want to do basically is talk a little bit about and invite you to discuss some of the problems that we have in a culture like ours with regard to education. There's a sense in which it ought to be easier than it is, and we ought to have less contention about the nature of schooling and indeed institutions like this. And what I'd like to do to begin with is have a sort of somewhat historical introduction. That's not right, is it? Whoops, there we go. So I'll start maybe less than 300,000 years ago, but maybe 200,000 years ago, according to the latest evolutionary stories that we can work out. It seems to have been the time of the last of the great large enlargements of the human brain. Clearly, having larger brains was of some evolutionary advantage to people at the time. It's been a disaster since, of course, but at the time, clearly some people were getting an advantage and breeding more. And so we have a situation, of course, the big problem, more vivid to some members of the audience than others was how to give birth to babies with increasingly large brains, because and there's just so much one can do, or the evolutionary problem of dealing with the change in the size of the pelvis to allow women to be able to give birth to these larger brain babies and walk at the same time. I mean, not at the same time as giving birth, but you know what I mean. And the solution, has been that we give birth, human beings, to babies with immature brains, so that when we are born, typically we have a brain size of about 350 cubic centimeters, which is much the same as a chimpanzee. And over the rest of its life, typically a chimpanzee adds about 100 cubic centimeters. Human beings, typically by age 5, have added over 1,000 cubic centimeters, and something odd is going on, and that oddity is in some ways the beginnings of the problems we have about education, that we have to care for our young in ways that no other animals that we know about do. And a part of that development, of course, is all tied in somehow to our preternatural ability to deal with symbols, that we can take entirely arbitrary events, create patterns, and perceive meaning in them, generate meaning and share that meaning in very peculiar ways. So language itself is one of these peculiarities. I'm sucking air into my lungs, gradually letting it out over the larynx and the pharynx and shaping it with the tongue. And this is a small range of the kinds of sounds human beings can make. I could be doing et cetera. But we've agreed that certain sets of sounds will have certain kinds of meanings, and it's really quite remarkable just how quickly we can code, decode, use these kinds of symbol systems with immense speed and rapidity. Indeed, to the point where, of course, once you have taken on board something like language, you can't stop the damn words. That is, you become the kind of animal who then is enslaved by the kind of language that we have developed. It has its utility, but it has its problems. And what I want to look at when we look at education are some of the problems tied to what we think of as the great gains, like indeed an oral language and literacy, etc. They all have costs, and which we tend not to notice adequately, I think, in education. You may know Zhuangzi, who describes, well, one of my favorite of his nice jokes, of course, is he's walking by the water and says to his disciple, "See how the fish are enjoying themselves and larking around." And the disciple says, "You're not a fish. How do you know that they're enjoying themselves?" And his lovely response, of course, was, "You're not me. How do you know that I don't know that," etc. And this could go on a long time with infinite regressions. And there's a sense in which we're idiots savant, of course, in language use. And the savant bit, of course, is the immense fluency and ease with which we use language. And the idiot part is, of course, that we keep using it at points when it becomes somewhat dysfunctional to us. Oops. Now, my history from 200,000 years ago, we're up to about 2,500 years ago. And this is taken from the Phaedrus. So, Plato describes, as he tries to deal with certain kinds of issues, he describes one morning this handsome young man, Phaedrus, coming from the walls of Athens, and Socrates is meeting him, and Phaedrus has got a scroll and is very excited. He's been to this really fascinating talk. And Socrates says, "Well, calm down. I mean, what we should do is, take off our sandals and go and sit by the Ilissus and under the shade of a plane tree and dangle our feet in the water and discuss, what you've been talking about." And Phaedrus does this, and the dialogue rambles a little bit. The Phaedrus is quite charming in the way it goes to and fro. And at one point, of course, Socrates raises questions about love, which he always did with these handsome young men, in case anything would come of it. And then they started talking about the talk. And at one point, Socrates tells the story of the ancient god Tot. Tot was an Egyptian god who was a really entrepreneurial kind of god. He'd invented things like dice and astronomy and writing, amongst other things. And being an entrepreneurial god, he had to go to the main funding agency for new ideas, and that turned out to be Tamus, who was the chief god of Egypt at the time. So he wrote his research proposals to Themis and said, look, I've got this one on dice. When our lads are working building pyramids, they get bored and tired, and if we have this game, it will entertain them and everything will be, I said, oh. So Themis says, that's a terrific idea, I'll certainly fund that. And he said, I've got this other idea about astronomy. He said, at the moment, our lads, when they go out on the boats, they have to stick to the coastline. And he said, with this astronomy stuff, you can navigate at night by the stars, so they can go just directly across the water. And he said, terrific idea. I'll fund that one as well. And then he said, I kept the best for last, and this is a new invention called writing. And he said, writing is so fantastic. What it does is it'll take the burden off our memories. That instead of having to remember everything, because if you're in an oral culture, you know only what you can remember. And once something is forgotten, it's gone forever. So the technologies of memory in oral cultures are immensely sophisticated. He says, by unloading this, all the anxieties that go with having to remember and all these tensions can be released from us, and we can use our minds for other things. And this is Themis's response. Basically, the crucial bits. I was told I had a pretty pointer too. I shouldn't be running around here. Is this notion that somehow he thinks the invention, he says, is not an aid to memory. He says, you give your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth. They will be the hearers of many things, and they will learn nothing. Now, what does this remind you of? We call it school. We are indeed the hearers of many things. And indeed, if you look at these reports of what students know when they come to a university or when they leave high school, it is a stunningly small amount of what they've actually been taught. If the curriculum is a vast encyclopedia of human knowledge, what is known is pitifully little at the end of schooling. And it shouldn't be so difficult because the world is wonderful and people like to know things. Do you know what state in the US is named after Julius Caesar? I'll give you a clue. In 55 BC, Caesar beat up the Britons. He then quartered his army over the winter on these islands off the coast of Gaul, and they became known as the Insulae Caesariae. Okay. And over the centuries, Caesariae degenerated. Oh, that's the wrong phrase, wrong word. It morphed from Caesariae, Jersey. So Jersey is actually a transformation of the word Caesar. So New Jersey is actually New Caesar. Okay. Isn't it nice to know that? The world is infinitely wonderful, and somehow we are not very good at enabling children to enjoy the wonders of the world around them. And what I want to try and do is explain some of the reasons, I think, why this is the case. I think, we'll come back to Plato. Education, sorry, I'm moving around too much. I should be still here. Education is, there's good news and bad news. And you see the good news. The good news is there's only 3 ideas, really, in education. The bad news for people who are involved in the business of education is that each of the ideas is mutually incompatible with the other 2. This makes for a difficult life. And if you think of some of the other main institutions that are a part of our culture, our societies, civilizations, many of them, things like the factory, the hospital, the prison, and the school, were all given their current shape more or less about the same time, sort of mid-late 19th century. And in some ways, the hospital is generally considered to be a successful institution, and that you get people who know how to fix, sew on arms that have dropped off and things like that, and in the same place as the people who've got the diseases. And there are problems with iatrogenic diseases and things like this that are created by being in hospital, and we get superbugs, but those are manageable. And in general, nobody wants to say that the superbug problem is such that we should abolish hospitals. In the same way, the factory is generally conceived as quite a good institution. You get the materials you need, the people with the skills to put the stuff together, and you do it a very efficient way. And there are problems, of course, in factories. We worried a bit, particularly earlier on, the dehumanizing effect of the being on the assembly line. But again, people have tried to work out ways to overcome that rather than disband the institution. The prison is a less comforting kind of institution. It's very hard to drive past a prison and say, there's a good institution at work. because somehow we feel uncomfortable. And part of the problem with the prison, of course, is that it has to both punish and rehabilitate at the same time. And that's difficult to do, because the more you're punishing somebody, the harder it is to rehabilitate them. And the more you're working on rehabilitation, the less it's going to seem like punishment. So there's a constant tension at work in the prison. The school is a little bit more problematic, I think, because it tries to do three things at the same time. It tries to socialize children, it tries to do this academic thing to them, and it tries to help develop the individual potential of each child. So now it would seem as though if you have a lot of caring and sensible people, we could have an institution that could do these three things together. But I think we don't do it well, not because it's not a managerial problem. I think it's a conceptual problem. And in education, most institutions, we're happier to try to deal with what seem to be the immediate problems of the institution rather than to try to rethink whether it's a good institution and whether we might change it in quite radical ways. And I think the school is sufficiently unsuccessful as an institution that we might try something a little bit more serious about it. So, just to look at these three ideas in a little more detail, the first idea, what we nowadays tend to call socialization, that is, what we tend to do with children in any particular culture is to homogenize them, to share a set of beliefs, values, and attitudes that make them fit into the adult culture. And you recognize success in your educational institution to the degree to which the children look like and grow into the kinds of people you have as adults at the time. And on the basis of socialization, you justify doing all kinds of things to children in the name of social utility. So if, for example, in the future, if they have to hunt mastodons, you have to teach the skills of mastodon hunting. If they're going to have to deal with computers, you have to build in training in computers and word processing and all these kinds of things. So anything you do to children in the name of future social utility is a part of what we call the socialization process. And these come from oral cultures where they were developed and refined, hundreds of thousands of years ago, not many, maybe 100,000 years to the present. And in those cultures, again, the technology of memory was hugely important. So people, for example, had to learn to tell stories and understand stories, because the story not only gives you information, but it tells you how to feel about the information that you're given. So you learn who you are, what your place in the world is, in story structures. And they're very subtle, the stories that are what we now call myth stories. They use little patterns like rhyme, rhythm, meter. Things are more memorable if put into metrical form. We can evoke from words vivid mental images that makes things even more memorable. So myth stories are full of rhythmic pattern things. Usually they're told to the string or a drum. And also they're full of the strangest, most bizarre images that caused great problems for Western anthropologists, particularly until almost the mid-20th century, because they couldn't work out what is in the mind of somebody who believes in myths, to quote the title of one famous book a while ago. So the function of the socializing is an affective orientation of the individual and the homogenizing of groups of individuals to share sets of beliefs and patterns of behavior, etc. So that in Burnaby today, we still expect our schools to produce sort of liberal, entrepreneurial, capitalist kinds of people. If this was happening in Tehran, there would be a bit of an outcry. And the same if we were turning out large number, turning all our population into radical Islamic fundamentalists, the parents would complain. So each society has this job of shaping and homogenizing the huge potential that human beings have to become different kinds of adults, but we homogenize them to very particular and restricted patterns. So that's our first job. The second idea, so idea number one is the socializing, homogenizing. The second idea essentially comes from Plato. Plato and Aristotle's great rhetorical enterprise of persuading everybody they should become the kinds of people who use their minds in a particular way. And for Plato, of course, becoming a well-socialized person was utterly disgraceful. That is a disgraceful thing to do with a mind, and he spent a lot of time trying to persuade people of this. what you do if you have a mind is to learn to use it as an instrument that can perceive the truth about reality, the truth about reality. And because his school was the school he founded when he went back from Syracuse to Athens was in a grove that was dedicated to the hero Academus. We call this enterprise, and institutions like this still, academic. So the enterprise of trying to work out how to shape the mind to perceive the truth about reality, and when you can sprinkle inverted commas through that phrase as you wish, as one that has given us another function that the school is supposed to perform. So that in Burnaby, all of the children are taught that the earth goes around the sun. It would make no difference at all to the lives of all the children in Burnaby if they believed the other was true, that the sun went around the earth. But we would think it disgraceful to tell them other than what we know as the truth about reality. So the school curriculum retains a lot of things that are useless, socially useless, but at the same time we consider good for the mind. So Plato's enterprise is one that focuses less on the society around you, but rather on the shaping of the mind to make it a particularly good instrument for perceiving the truth. And we still assume that that's one of the things we should be doing in schools. The third task we still assume that our schools are to perform is essentially, well, Rousseau perhaps put it better than many, should we say. Mad as a hatter, but that's all right. Sorry, one shouldn't speak this way about one's intellectual forebears. But Rousseau had the notion, I mean, as he says in the Emile, this sort of slightly bizarre novel treatise on education, that Plato certainly had been the greatest educational thinker before this time. He didn't then go on to say the obvious, until me, as Rousseau would put it, until Rousseau came along to tell us. And he said, Plato's idea was very good, but the trouble is it tended to turn out what I guess Montaigne calls asses loaded with books. The assumption that somehow learning a certain set of disciplines was going to deliver to you a way of better perceiving the way you should exist in the world, how you perfect yourself as a human being, clearly wasn't working when he looked at the schools around him, because people had taken this notion that you achieve these kinds of insights about the world, both moral as well as intellectual, by learning certain things in significant detail. And what seemed to be happening is not that these disciplines were creating well-rounded people, but rather they were producing academics, the worst form of human life, as it were. But people, asses loaded with books. There was a sense in which great intellectual energy was expended, but not essentially feeding all kinds of understandings. And somehow Rousseau thought the school, the mode of education, was at the heart of the problem. So he recommended that the real problem was that people were not attentive to the nature of childhood, that somehow it was assumed that the trick of education was to get this knowledge into the mind of the child. And it didn't matter too much how you did that, which of course are the schools where you beat children mercilessly if they hadn't learned their 5 times tables, which is a technique that works moderately well. I mean, if you have life and death control over children, you can have wonderful achievements in scores in schools, but we don't do that, so we don't get them motivated in appropriate ways. Rousseau's belief was that we attend to the nature of the child's developmental process, and that we attend to the nature of their intellectual development, and we attend to what motivates the child. So we study these things so that we get a scientific understanding, not the terms Rousseau uses, but the terms that his ideas have led to today, of the nature of childhood, the nature of development, the nature of learning, all these kinds of things. This is what people in education faculties study. It's quite funny, really, but that's what they do. And somehow it's believed that if you know more and more and more about these things, we can be much more effective in educating. Now, we've had, 250 years of trying to do this better, and it's not obvious that we're meeting with conspicuous success. It's not obvious that the kinds of schools we have today are so much more successful than the kinds of schools we had earlier. Now, there are other reasons why that's the case. In the past, education was a process that was designed for males who were going to run a society. And today, the education system is designed for everybody and teaches them how to be good democratic citizens in this kind of culture. But at the same time, we still believe, and indeed, if you look at what is taught in education faculties, you'll find it's a very Rousseauian curriculum. That you may be familiar with the Genevan psychologist Jean Piaget. Piaget was the most purely Rousseauian psychologist, believing that he had managed to somehow describe more or less adequately the way in which children's minds spontaneously develop as long as they have adequate interactions with the environment. I always try to remind my students that this is a pure superstition. There's no reason to believe that the mind develops in the way the body does. For Rousseau, he believed that as the body is, if you eat lots of broccoli, you don't begin to look more like a broccoli, but your body develops through a predetermined pattern from babyhood, childhood, adolescence, etc. And he thought the mind was the same. And the trick for the educator was to work out what that developmental process actually was. Now, I think there are good reasons to think that the way food, and indeed Piaget talks about these things as aliments, that the intellectual aliments that shape the development, stimulate the development of the mind. There are good reasons, I think, to think that the way food stimulates and helps the pre-programmed developmental process of the body is quite unlike the way in which knowledge will stimulate and further the development of the mind. But we needn't go into that. But still, those kinds of ideas dominate our schools today. It's assumed that if a teacher needs to know more about the child to be able to educate the child adequately. And that's, I guess, our third idea. Now, whoops. So those are our three ideas. Socializing, the Platonic idea, the academic notion, and the Rousseauian notion of supporting the development of the potential of each individual child. What I'll try and persuade you of is that these three ideas are mutually incompatible. And I'll start with the first, the notion of socializing. If you socialize somebody, you initiate them into society as fully as possible. That's the criterion you use in determining how adequately you're conducting the socializing process. If you're doing the Platonic thing, you're making them skeptical of the dominant forms and patterns and beliefs of the society that you're introducing them to. Hard to do those two things at the same time. That is to persuade somebody of the truth of something and at the same time make them skeptical of that thing. So, and we don't manage that, I think, incompatibility very well. Let me give you a peculiar example, maybe that exemplifies why we should think this is a real incompatibility and not just tied into the words I'm using, not letting the fly out of this particular fly bottle, as it were. Imagine that, well, I should pretend it's true, but imagine that Premier Campbell, with a new enthusiasm, has discovered that the way money is distributed in the society of British Columbia is quite unjust. So he's got a new process whereby people will get their salaries adjusted. And this will involve each citizen having to go to the cinema once a week. So you get Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, Fridays. And you turn up at the cinema, you watch the movie that's on, and then when you come out in the foyer, you don't go off to Starbucks to chat about the movie, but in the foyer there are lots of tables, and one will have your name on, and there'll be a multiple choice test on the table. And the multiple choice test will have questions like, what was the color of the car in the third chase scene? You get red, blue, taupe, shadow gray, and you tick. And then what was the name of the heroine's dog? Toby, Eridanus, whatever, And now, depending on how well you do on the multiple choice test, your salary is determined for the next week, okay? So this is how we're going to do it forever. Now, and the following week, you go back to the cinema, another movie, another multiple choice test. How well you do on that multiple choice test determines your salary for the following week. Now, imagine, 6 months down, 6 years down the path. There'll be huge psychological testing services and agencies that will help you, become better at memorizing, and you'll be watching the movie and say, oh, what was the name of the dog? What was the name of the dog? So you'll find that, and of course, after 6 years, everybody will take it for granted that this is entirely the way we should be doing things. I think the problem with the school is that we don't actually think about our institutions. We think through them. We take for granted the institutions that surround us, and they frame the ways we think about the world. And I think something like that people would take it for granted after a while is the best way to do things. But don't count on it happening. What's happening there? The pleasure of watching movies is undercut, of course, because you've created great anxiety about what's happening, because your salary is going to be turning on how well you do on the test. And at the same time, this is not a very sensible way of determining how people should be paid, because it decouples the value of work to the society from the actual reward that people get. So we've got a conflict there that undercuts both of the purposes. Now, when we apply this to education, what does it remind you of? We call it school. That is, what we do is get children to answer multiple choice tests on things like, what were the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, or what's involved in the process of photosynthesis, or whatever it might be. And we test them on these things, and depending on how well or badly they do, we adjust their life chances so that they will become either a janitor or an airline pilot or a CEO of a large corporation or a university professor, depending on how good they are at doing these kinds of things. But it's not obvious that remembering for a particular test what counts as the right answer, which you then forget immediately anyway, is the best way to determine how we should allot people to particular jobs in this kind of society. We could probably do that better than using the academic program that they're taking as a means of doing a social sorting activity. So we're confusing the social sorting requirement that the school performs, the socializing actions of the school, with the academic ones. And and consequently we're undercutting both. That is, we're destroying the pleasure of the academic activity by making it fraught with anxiety for children all the time, even if that anxiety seems to be low level, but it also bores them out of their minds much of the time. And we're also doing a very poor job of using the school as an instrument for preparing kids for particular jobs in the society. So the two tasks, the socializing task and the academic task, that are supposed to be, jointly managed by the school, can't be. It's not a managerial problem. It's a conceptual problem. You cannot do these two things well at the same time, because they constantly not just interfere with each other, but they undermine each other to some significant degree. So if you look at the second conflict, maybe, between, again, the process of socialization and the Rousseauian notion of developing the potential of each individual child naturally and spontaneously, you have another obvious conflict. In the first case, with socializing, you're initiating the child as fully as possible into society. And of course, for Rousseau, you hold society at bay, because society is one, as he puts it, one mass of folly and contradiction. And of course, the society will shape the child and constrict the child to perform certain tasks, whereas the purpose of education is to enlarge and expand and let the child explore the universe, etc., etc. Again, you can't do those two things at the same time. I have another brief scenario, okay, to try and exemplify this principle. You have to imagine in this case that you're in a society where, normal for many of us, I suppose, that when you're 12 or 13 or 14, you have this image of what you want to be in life. A fisher in the Pearl Seas, a ballet dancer, a rock star, whatever it might be, professor of education, the highest possibilities for human life. But somehow what happens is, you go to university, you get stuck in certain courses, you get these opportunities, you get shaved, you get married, you have the children, running around, taking them to, ballet classes and soccer and all the rest of it. And then they leave home, and you find that you're, between 45 and 65. And somehow at this point, there's this little voice you hear inside you saying, "Remember me? Remember me?" And this is the voice of the person that you wanted to become, the real you that was supposed to find its outlet in being a pearl fisher or a ballet dancer or something. And as you can imagine, the government has a program for you as well. And this program is called RETRY, which is an acronym for Rediscover the Real You. I'm quite proud of that one, actually. RETRY, rediscover. And you can enter this program anytime between 45 and 65. And the government will pay for it, and it's manned by, again, immensely expensive psychologists. You find, though, in the process of, and they're there to empower you to become the real you, not the you that's been constrained and constricted and made miserable and all the rest of it by the kind of socializing and the jobs you've had and the positions you've been in. But it's going to open up these possibilities that were always there for you, and now the government's here to help you. But you then discover that the success of the program is counted in terms of the degree to which you accept that the person you have become is actually the real you. This is the best of your possibilities, okay? Now, you might feel appropriately cheated because clearly there's a conflict here. You know, the person you want to become has this freedom and ease and possibilities that society has somehow constrained. And we see that constantly going on in the schools, of course, and indeed in our lives generally. The need to fit into some social niche constrains our possibilities, and in some ways not ways that are particularly desirable to us. And we spend a great deal of our time and energy trying to overcome these in some way. The last two are maybe more obvious in some way. For Plato, education was a time-related and essentially epistemological process. That is, if you look at the way he tries to describe the educational process, it's about becoming increasingly clear in understanding the true nature of things, to use somewhat unplatonic language. But if you look at Rousseau's notion of becoming educated, it's an age-related one, because he believed there is this inbuilt program that we go through. He fudges the ages a little. I mean, there's certain flexibility, obviously, in these ages, but it's age-related. Certain things happen to you at particular ages, and it's a largely psychological process. It's very hard to put those two together happily. And they're easier to see because every argument you see about education in the newspapers and certainly going on in the schools is a battle between what they're given the names of traditionalist Plato, that is this back to basics, private schools that want to ensure that their children master all the discipline, knowledge, and get into universities, etc. And the Rousseauian notion that somehow what the education should be like in the school is this exploration, this relatively unconstrained attention to fulfilling the potential of each child. Okay, can't do both of those adequately in the same institution at the same time, I think. Oops, same mistake every time. Now, what I want, we've got till 20 past, so I've got to tell you the truth in 10 minutes. This is easy. When I said there were 3 ideas, I actually lied. There are 3.5 ideas in education. The half idea is sort of a child of, another of the children of Darwin, I guess, or rather a child of Herbert Spencer. The belief that somehow what we do in the process of education is recapitulate the process that the race has gone through in reaching the pinnacle of human civilization, which was indeed Herbert Spencer. So that the trick for the educator then was to work out how to support the child to reach that pinnacle of European middle-class male achievement, and gradually recognize, in a Rousseauian way, the steps to achieve it. There were a number of kinds of recapitulation ideas that were trotted out in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Some of them you've probably seen these, the hairy monkey thugs, gradually becoming the gleaming upright men that you used to see on the school walls as somehow a representation of how we've become perfected. The evolution is an onward progressive process, etc., not recognizing that it's a random process all over the place. But there are also logical kind of recapitulations notions that somehow there's a logic built into all the knowledge that is a part of the curriculum, and the trick of education was to start with the first stuff and gradually work our way up, so that and you get guidance for your curriculum by looking at the history of the development of these disciplines in our cultural history. It's an idea that leads a lot of tweaking to make work, because it's one, if indeed you look at it in Western terms, you start with very sophisticated geometry in grade 1, and then you get to arithmetic about grade 5, and you discover the 0 in grade 6. I mean, it's a very difficult one to make work. And do you teach the kids in grade 1 that the Earth is the center of the universe, and the stars and planets are just zipping around on a glassy surface, etc.? And then in grade 3, so there are lots of problems with just following the logic of the development of the disciplines that we consider central to education. There's another idea, the half idea, partly developed by Lev Vygotsky, who unfortunately Stalin got to, well, no, I guess tuberculosis got to him before Stalin did, but it was a close race. Vygotsky had this notion that the way human beings develop, the best way to account for this peculiar process is that what happens when you're born into a society is that you pick up a bunch of cognitive tools or psychological tools. And somehow the trick is to recognize that there are ways in which we can maximize the toolkit. And our cultural history is essentially the creation of a mass of cognitive tools. Let me talk briefly about, whoops, one too many. Whoops, go back. Whoops. I thought this would make it go back, going the other way. Sorry about this. Nothing will make it do anything. Thank you. I knew this. Sorry. Thank you. So part of the work that I've been involved with has been to try to take this Vygotskian notion and try and spell out in some detail what these tools might look like, and one of the ways I've characterized it is to talk about the ways in which we get large-scale toolkits, and then how these tools are made up of smaller-scale cognitive tools. So you would have, for example, when you get a body as a human being, you get a toolkit for making sense of the world around you, and that particular toolkit involves things like the senses, of course, but it involves also the emotions. With a human body, you get a bunch of emotions, and you use these for the rest of your life as your main orienters to meaning. Okay? Something we tend to forget with children in schools, that their emotions are one of the main toolkits they have for learning. You also get a sense of humor. I mean, human beings are bizarre creatures in that by the end of the second month, for sure, virtually every child, everywhere, in every circumstance, smiles. And that smile is a part of how we tie ourselves into relationships with others. And humor is hugely important as one of the great tools for both sense-making and the kind of sense, and indeed making our lives that little bit more pleasurable. We also have music. We are a musical animal. Did you know Stephen Mithen's book, The Singing Neanderthal? Is that familiar? And now it's a bit ropey in places, but it's an interesting notion that somehow he believes that with a kind of rhythm, pattern are so important to us that indeed a language itself is born out of the delight in rhythm, pattern, organizing, and the ways in which we ascribe to these things meaning. And music is the greatest mystery of all, in some sense, utterly devoid of any cognitive content, or certainly, but somehow we read into certain sets of sounds often enormously profound emotions. And why should we do that? I mean, it's very strange the way this patterning ability we have leads to all kinds of. Anyway, so with the body, you've got this kind of toolkit, and then when you get an oral language, you get a whole new toolkit. With the oral language toolkit, which everybody learns easily. You can't not learn an oral language if you're in an oral language using environment. You get things like the ability to form images from words, the kinds of things we saw earlier in terms of the skills of remembering. And also, perhaps most vividly, you get the ability to represent the world, to shape the world into stories. And the stories have great meaning for us. That's what stories essentially tell us how to feel. If, for example, whoops, half a minute left. If I tell you he shot Tom, none of you burst into tears or started cheering. But if I say that he always wore a nice jacket and tie and loved his grandmother, and Tom used foul language in front of children and picked his nose in public, you begin to feel glad that he shot Tom, right? But we learn that Tom, despite his unprepossessing exterior, was an undercover cop trying to stop Tom and the grandmother from selling drugs to kids outside schools, etc. And then you begin to feel sorry. So, and you know how to feel about the events that make up a story when you get to the end. And you know you've got to the end when you know how to feel about the events that make it up. If, in despair that this might never end or make sense to you, this lecture, you decide to run out the door and then you trip rather badly and sprain your ankle really, really badly. It would have been better if you'd broken it, but you've got this really terrible sprain. And now, whether or not this is an appropriate punishment for walking out of my lecture is one thing. But you feel, oh, shoot, if I hadn't gone to that lecture, I wouldn't have this awful. And you're taken down to the health center and then off to the hospital, and it's bound up, and you're told, don't go out for a few days, rest it. And then you go out finally, and you go down to the local 7-Eleven, and you buy a lottery ticket, and you win $24 million. Now you're glad or sorry you came to the lecture, because if you hadn't, you wouldn't have twisted your ankle, you wouldn't have the $24 million. But of course, what you do with the $24 million is buy that Lamborghini, well, some of you, or the yacht, we'll say, and you go out on English Bay, and the first time out, you drown. Now are you sorry you came to the lecture? And the Greeks had this nice, phrase, call nobody happy until they're dead, because it's only at the end that we can make meaning of the elements that make up the unit. And the story is immensely important for human beings because it's the only unit of language that we have invented that can tell us how to feel about events. So I've got a book called Teaching is Storytelling that tries to persuade teachers to see that stories can be shaped in ways to make the content of the curriculum meaningful in an emotional and an imaginative way to students. And the romantic is you get a whole new toolkit with literacy. It transforms your thinking. And the trouble with these, as Plato told us about writing, is once you have learned to write and become literate in a Western sense in particular, you cannot go home again. You're alienated from the natural world. That is you think should be our heritage as animals, but we're an animal that's created an alienation for ourselves by the kinds of cognitive tools that we have created in our cultural history. And I won't go on anymore because I should stop, and I don't know if there's time for questions, comments, abuse. Okay. 3 hours? Are you okay? Oh, okay. Well, I was going to just briefly talk about some of the tools that you get. Well, with the mythic, what I'm calling mythic, with this oral language, you get the use of stories, images from words, a whole range of whole range that I've written down over there, but I'm not going to retrieve, of tools that help you make sense of the world in a richer way. When you become literate, you have the possible disadvantage of being in some way disinherited from your birthright, so you can't go home again. But what you can do is you make associations when you're, try and remember what it was like when you were 11 years old, which is when these things tend to kick in. And one of the things you discover is reality. There's a strange sense in which human beings discover reality between when they become literate, a new conception of reality. If you think of the 6-year-old who listens to Cinderella, typically the 6-year-old doesn't ask what means of locomotion did this fairy godmother use, or what's the physics of changing pumpkins into coaches. They just accept the magic as long as it carries the narrative along. But at 10 or 11, if you're told the equally fantastic story of Superman, you have to know that his dad, Marlon Brando, shot him up into space. He landed somewhere on Earth, and the molecular structure of our sun is such that when he gets down to his pajamas, he has these superhuman powers. And my favorite, for obvious reasons, was always the Hulk. And this was because he got close. You have to provide, I guess, what philosophers call an etiology for you cannot simply accept the magic. You have to create a kind of plausibility to it to make it acceptable, which you don't do earlier. And it has to do with, in complicated ways, I think, how we construct a new image of reality with literacy as a direct product of literacy. And the tools that come along with that, again, try and think of when you're 11. if there's an awful lot of reality around and you're 11 years old, you don't know where it ends. If it's infinite, you're infinitely insignificant. Not an easy thing to take on board. So what do you do? Well, like every other 11-year-old on the planet, you make an association with someone or something that seems best able to overcome the threats that hem you in. So if you're 11 years old, you have to wear what your mother tells you. You have to adhere to bus timetables, school rules and regulations, etc. Your ego is developing, but you're constrained at the same time. By making an association with someone or something that can overcome those threats, you are given some sense of power. And so the girl might associate with Britney Spears. Britney clearly doesn't have to wear what her mother tells her, we hope. And she doesn't have to worry about bus timetables. She has the freedom, the power that the girl is lacking, in the same way that David Beckham maybe has the skill, the strength, the money that the boy is lacking. So we make an association with things to help us make richer sense of our experience. And if, again, none of these things, none of these tools go away, if you want to pause for a moment and think, who are your heroes? Are you thinking who your heroes are? Who's your, probably intellectual heroes? Marie Curie, the Dalai Lama? I don't know. It'll tell you something about what you remain insecure about, okay? So that's the function of this particular tool, that it gives us a protection against certain forms of insecurity. I found actually there's no point talking for a minute or two because people are thinking, does that mean I'm insecure about something? But who knows? And with, it's not just the association with the heroic, a sense of wonder. A number of tools come along with this peculiar development of literacy. Another thing that happens typically with bright, well-educated kids, about 14, 15, 16, is the development of a new kind of language. I remember when we took our kids to play soccer, I'd have two boys in the car, one about 12 and the other about 15 at the time. And during elections, they'd have the signs on the lawns all over Vancouver. And the 12-year-old would be interested in whose side are we on? Who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? And the 15-year-old would be saying things like, why would anybody change their vote because somebody's got a sign on their lawn? Why would we vote for the Liberals because the Smiths have got a sign on their lawn? Or, what's going on? So he was asking questions that led to, in some sense, a theoretic language. And he was building a sense of politics and society and all kinds of concepts that then would give him great power to deal with stuff in the world. They have their own disabilities, but you could see the development of a theoretic thinking. And it's what I'm calling a philosophic kind of understanding that is developed. And it has a whole range of, essentially the craving for generality is central to this, that you're looking for the truth with a capital T most of the time. So in the romantic stage here, or what do we call it, children looking at history, for example, would be fascinated by the bright bits and pieces. This philosophic, theoretic way, you're suddenly realizing you can't transcend history and look down on it, but you are caught up in it. You're a part of a process. And you begin to see yourself as caught as in a spider's web, and that you're a part of psychological processes, social processes, historical processes, that your identity is already created by the conditions you find yourself in. And the nice phrase is, I am born with a past, and that past determines me in very significant ways. And there are a number of other tools. And finally, the ironic is simply that immense reflexiveness on the language we use, and you discover that the kinds of theories that you're going to develop in the philosophic are never adequate to the purposes you have for them. That our theories are always inadequate to our purposes, our languages are always inadequate to what we want to express in them. And that ironic, reflexive kind of understanding is perhaps best exemplified by the Monty Python series, the constant play with and exploration of the limits of the ways in which we have of knowing. But also it's a kind of modulator, the ironic development of all the other tools that you develop in the process of picking up in a Vygotskian way the cognitive tools that are a part of the culture that we have inherited. That's a good line to stop on, so I'll do that. Thank you.
Questions, please.
Please use the microphone. Yes. Next.
So suppose we want to
do education better. You know, I mean, what I see here is it's like a set of knots people are tied in. Almost, you know, for example, your example of the people being tested as they come out of the movies is resonant with me. You know, and I see that as the kind of distraction I'm seeing all the time that kind of diverts a field from what it should be, plus maybe selects the wrong people who end up in it. And you know, in the worst cases, then the movies that are being selected later, you can only see them from the people who have excelled at those tests.
Yeah, and you have no choice on the movie you see either, yes.
But what I'm really trying to see is some way forward here, you know.
Well, I mean, I think an enormous step forward could be made simply by recognizing those different purposes of schooling. See, nearly all the arguments one sees about testing in schools are due to the confusion of the academic purpose of the school and the socializing purpose. If we could say, very simply, that the academic activities of the school should never be graded because they're not the kinds of things you can sensibly grade. The socializing activities of the school should be graded constantly and in detail because those are the things, and because it doesn't matter too much the degree to which somebody becomes academically gifted, whereas it does matter a great deal that all the socializing purposes of the school should be clearly graded, and children should know, or we should know what children are able to do and be able to allot them to particular kinds of jobs. Now that's simplistic, but you could separate out the socializing activities and the academic activities in ways that I think would allow us to do both much better without any huge improvement. We wouldn't need to do very much to our teaching staff. It doesn't require virtuoso teaching, it just requires a recognition that some activities are not amenable to grading without destroying them. And other activities should be graded because that's exactly what we want to know, who's good at these kinds of things. Am I getting... and there's an awful lot of other things we could do. But that's it.
So I was thinking about the fact that the school is an institution, the university is an institution. Some people have opted out of the institution by homeschooling. Yes. Is that simply trying to reproduce the institution at home?
No, I think many people, well, maybe like many people in the room, when our children reached school age, we met with many of our neighbors and thought, is there a way can we save our children from this awful institution? I mean, you know, from a professor of education, this is a wonderful line. It became clear that our motives were quite different. Some had purely academic motives. They thought that the school was not very good as an academic institution, and they valued those kinds of academic activities. Others were unhappy some for social reasons, some because they didn't like the schools that were local and they didn't like other features of schooling. And some, it was a moral issue. You know, they didn't want their children getting into drugs, you know, by age 5 or 6 or whatever it might be. So, but I think the homeschooling movement is so varied in its motives that it's very hard to give it a single explanation. I don't know, I think is what I mean.
Can I ask you a follow-up?
Yes.
As someone who's just in the process of writing the academic 3-year plan for the university,
right.
Should I be paying attention to these conflicting
Yes, I
purposes?
think so. Well, as you know, actually I had dinner with Michael Waters last night, and we sat on the committee that did a significant revision to our undergraduate program, and we had a lot of fun dealing with these kinds of issues. And indeed, I think one of the problems universities have is again not recognizing those distinctions and how they should operate. But I think we've sold our souls, as you're well aware, in a way that is very hard in a university to recover. You know, once the multiversity is in place and we've mixed these three things up fairly profoundly, though particularly in the large US universities, it's very clear that within the university there is a university. And the trick for the smart undergraduate is to find it. And often it's around some special institute in the place. I remember at Cornell they had the Institute for the Humanities, which was the university. There was a lot of stuff going on around. There was agricultural college and all kinds of stuff, and there was the English department that was essentially training people to do good jobs in the society. But if you really wanted to study and think about English literature and its relationship to history and all, you went to the Society for the Humanities, and there'd be bizarre seminars there that you could take and visit. And I think all universities have that, and indeed, as you know, we're trying to create something like that at Simon Fraser with the Burnaby Mountain College, it's currently called. That would be a center where there would be, what we think of as an academic institution that would be somewhat different from many of the courses that have become infected, I think, with, that's the wrong word, because they're entirely appropriate to have socializing activities, but I think, and training activities, but I do think we should do a better job at separating them out from the purely academic activities, and we should think of grading them differently, But those are, anyway, good luck with that.